morning. Welcome. Thanks so much to all of you for joining us today and for being with us this morning. Very excited to have you tuning in with us this morning for the latest segment in our ongoing series of Friday morning gatherings and conversations as we highlight innovative education leaders and cutting-edge education ideas from all across Tennessee and across the country. In the spirit of SCORE's commitment in our mission as an organization that we really seek to catalyze innovative change in education, and in our core values as an organization that many of the most difficult challenges in education can be solved through creative and innovative solutions, we want to highlight innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders who are really leading the way for students. And our intent in these sessions is to pick a single topic, a single cutting-edge idea each time and do a deep dive to quickly learn more, to hear from leading entrepreneurs and innovators, and hopefully to trigger some thoughts or ideas that you can take away and apply in your own daily work. I know how busy everyone is, so our goal here is to keep these sessions brief and informal. And just would say, we'll be taking questions, obviously, throughout the conversation. Feel free to add any questions you have into the chat box as we go, and I'll be sure to surface as many as we can during the conversation. This morning, I'm really excited to welcome Todd Williams, the founding chairman and CEO of the Commit Partnership in Dallas, Texas. Working together, the partnership cultivates a collaborative educational ecosystem across school systems, higher education institutions, city, county, and state governments, foundations, nonprofits, employers, and workforce agencies to positively impact education and workforce development across the North Texas region. Todd has been a key player in how Texas has approached student-centered funding reform. In 2017, Todd was appointed to the year-long Texas Commission on Public School Finance by Governor Greg Abbott and chaired its outcome committee. He's also the former chair of the Citizen Budget Review Commission for Dallas Independent School District, and he's the former vice chair of the Board of Trustees for Uplift Education, a public charter school management organization serving almost 20,000 students across the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Importantly, given Tennessee's current consideration of student-centered funding reform, we wanted to look at and learn from Todd as well as other states and communities that have experience with comprehensive funding reform focused on serving students well. So we're very pleased to have Todd joining us this morning to learn more about Todd's experience and Texas's experience and the important work that's been underway in that state. So I've got a few opening questions that I'll start with, and then we'll turn it over to Todd to share a bit more about his work and the work in Texas. And we just would say again, for everyone else who has joined, please feel free to add any questions you have in the chat box. I'll surface those to Todd as we go through the conversation this morning. So Todd, maybe just to get us started, before we dive into a conversation around funding reform in Texas and the work that happened in 2019, why don't you take just a few minutes to share a quick overview of Commit, the work you're doing in Dallas, and then maybe we'll jump into some specific questions about education funding.
Sure, David, glad to be with you. Commit was formed in 2012, so we're on our 10th year anniversary. We're about 65 people who get up every day thinking about how to improve public education outcomes and post-secondary credential attainment aligned with high demand jobs and achievement of a living wage in Dallas County. About 2/3 of our work is focused in Dallas County, which is about the 8th largest county in the nation, about 2.5 million people, about 500,000 kids in K-12. And then about 20 of our staff are focused on state policy work and analytics work. Sometimes I refer to ourselves as the consultant that never leaves. We're funded philanthropically by both regional funders as well as national funders. And we are highly focused on using data and robust analytics to highlight what are the root causes of the outcomes that we're getting and how can we change funding streams, how can we change alignment of interests, incentives, how can we spread best practices to get those outcomes up. And so we're blessed to be a partner with you, do similar work obviously in Tennessee, and we're blessed to be thought partners with you.
Awesome. Thanks so much again, Todd, for being with us and for sharing that, for the important work you're doing. So we'll come back to some of the specific Commit work in a bit when we talk about outcomes-based funding, but want to really turn our attention first and foremost to Texas's education finance reform effort. And as you and our viewers who are with us today know, Tennessee is deep in its conversation right now about modernizing the education finance system in our state. And in addition to lots of public engagement that's been led by our State Department of Education over the last many months, Governor Lee announced in his State of the State address just a couple of weeks ago a significant recurring investment in public education, along with a commitment to transition to a new student-weighted funding formula. So we're in this moment of change, potential change in Tennessee. And so I'd love to hear about your experience with Texas's HB3 funding work, funding reform work. What prompted Texas to pursue finance reform? What did that reform include? And then maybe even what was your role? What was your role in that work?
Sure. I think leading up to 2017, 2018, our legislature meets every 2 years for about 3.5, 4 months. And we had this ongoing battle between education advocates that wanted as much funding as possible, as unrestricted as possible. And then we had fiscal conservatives who said, look at our current outcomes. Why should we put more money in the system? Let's just disrupt it. Charters, vouchers, et cetera. And neither one had a significant amount of ability to rule the day. And so the net result was, for several sessions, we didn't really do much in school finance. And so the finally decision was made in 2017 that we're going to form a commission to study it. It was 13 members appointed by various leaders of the state. And frankly, going into that, which at the beginning of 2018, it was really unclear how committed we were all going to be and what the net outcome was going to be. And I would tell you that in retrospect, and I've been told this by people who've been involved in the legislature for a long time, the big difference in our commission and why I think it was so successful was that it focused on goals. What do we want to try and achieve? What are our current outcomes? How do we want to move those outcomes? Who's doing great work around the state? And how might we really tailor our funding to a set of strategies that would allow us to move outcomes and hit an overall goal? And frankly, create it almost like a continuous improvement process. So every 2 years, we look at the data, figure out what progress we've made or didn't make, and then adjust our funding accordingly to try and get to a goal.
Awesome. And I know we've got, I don't know if you wanted, Todd, maybe go through some of the slides. I know that you had prepared now on the bill itself. We can pull that up if that's helpful, just to kind of walk through what that work looked like.
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, that'd be great. So give you a sense, in Texas, 5.4 million students, 10% of the country, it's large. We ranked 38th in the country in per pupil funding at the beginning of this the year-long commission to study our school finance. And yet we ranked 12th in the nation in kids who were considered economically disadvantaged, and second in the nation in English language learners. So there was a disconnect in terms of our funding versus the challenges that we were facing. So there was a lot of discussion in that commission about how to make our system more equitable and how do we make sure that we're driving funding toward where the needs were the most based on outcomes. If you'll go to the next slide. We were really focused on the fact that our Governor Abbott, had set a goal back in 2015 of 60 by 30. So 60% of our young adults, 25 to 34, would have a post-secondary education, 2-year degree, 4-year degree, technical certificate by the year 2030. And so it was helpful for us to kind of focus on where we stood relative to that goal, given that we'd all been talking about it and working toward it for several years at the time the commission met. So if you go to the next slide. So we really broke down our kids in terms of where they can consider non-low income or low income. And because 61% of our low income kids, you could see that our 6-year post-secondary completion rate, so by the age of 24, 6 years beyond high school graduation, only 18% of our low income kids were getting a post-secondary credential versus 38% for our non-low income kids. And so we said, listen, if we were able to get our non-low income kids up to 100%, which is obviously a tremendous stretch goal, we still couldn't get to our goal of 60% with our own pipeline. We'd only be at 51%, which is that far right column. So it was very clear that we needed to focus a lot on our kids who were dealing with economic disadvantage in their communities and in their homes. We also basically said, what are the outcomes? And so we developed a pipeline, if you will. So 46% of our kids are enrolled in pre-K, 52% are kindergarten ready, and 43% were judged meeting the state standard in 3rd grade reading, which was a big challenge for us because we ranked 46th in the country in 3rd grade reading. And we never got academic achievement materially above our 3rd grade reading scores. And you can see, but we were graduating 92% of our kids, but only 42% were ready, and only half of them were enrolling in post-secondary, and 28% were completing. So again, if you just broke down our pipeline into these areas, it also helped target where we should focus, not only which kids, but also where in their educational pipeline should we drive policy and funding to try and move these outcomes up. We also broke down what we call the 8th grade cohort data. So this is just for low-income kids in Texas, 173,000 kids you can see there on the far left. And where were we losing kids? Well, 27% were not completing high school. Another 29% were completing high school, but then not enrolling in college. And then another 31% were enrolling in college, but then not completing within 6 years. So our 6-year completion rate for our low-income kids was only 13%. So we're never going to get to a 60% goal with 60% of our population being economically disadvantaged and only achieving at a 13% outcome. So obviously this was a big driver in terms of our strategies. Next slide. We also focus on the fact of, if you think about, I talked about 3rd grade reading, and I talked about what was happening at the post-secondary completion pipeline. We also focus a lot on teachers and where were our, what was happening with our teacher pipeline. And this just basically, we basically divide up all our school districts by economic disadvantage. And then we basically said that as you move from left to right on this graph and your districts get increasingly economically disadvantaged, guess what happens? The percentage of teachers that are beginning goes up. The percentage of teachers who are turning over and leaving goes up. And if you just control for economic disadvantage, which is the blue dots, economic disadvantage goes down. So what should we be doing to try and get our best teachers to stay in the classroom, and to, more importantly, to incentivize them to go into the high poverty classrooms where they're needed most to try and address this? And I'll talk about the strategies that we came up with that in a second. So if you think about what ultimately came out of this year-long commission, was really 4 levers. Every child is ready to learn, every child is ready to earn, every educator is ready to teach, and every child is equitably supported. And I'll go through those one by one. So what ultimately came out of HB3 that was passed, just to give you a sense, 149-1 in the House and unanimously 31-0 in the Senate. Full day pre-K4 funding, because again, of 3rd grade reading, it was a highly correlated to actually becoming literate. We actually required every school district in the state to set 5-year goals in 3rd grade reading and math and disaggregate them by race and by income. We found that a lot of school boards did not really understand where they stood in regard to this critical. So it's better to have them set goals and report on that publicly on their website, et cetera. And we also focused a lot on incentives in HB3. So if you want to extend the school year by up to 30 days, the state would fund half of that, up to about $1.6 billion commitment. Also implementation of dual language, and also supporting more students with dyslexia. And then we ultimately decided that because 3rd grade reading was such a big challenge for us, to require all 80,000 teachers in pre-K through 3 to go through the science of literacy training, because so many of our teachers are coming through teacher pipelines where they do not receive that training, and it was showing up in terms of their own testimony about how prepared they were to teach literacy. And in terms of every child is ready to learn, we focused, and now if you ask me what is the one provision that I think has the most impact to change, it is this one: college and career success per pupil funding. So for every student who graduates high school and is judged to be college and career ready by one of several assessments, SAT, ACT, TSII, et cetera, and then they either enroll in college or they get an industry certificate, the district gets $3,000. If that student is economically disadvantaged, they get $5,000. And effectively, that means that for a district like Dallas ISD, which is our second biggest district in the state, they would get $45 million. Based on current outcomes, they're getting 3. And so there's a tremendous incentive to continuously resource this area and to spend much more dollars in college access, to get our ratios down for advisors to kids, and to really make sure that there's somebody highly focused on that transition from K-12 to industry certification or to college enrollment. Again, we also required our boards to set goals in terms of what was happening with CCMR, college and career military readiness, and again, disaggregated by race and by income. We required, which is being implemented this year, every student to graduate high school must complete their FAFSA. We stole that idea from Louisiana based on their great results. And now Illinois, California, other states have copied that. There's a parental opt-out feature, but I think because we did this because we were leaving $500 million plus of US federal Pell Grants on the table every year because kids weren't filling out the FAFSA. So this was a great way to incentivize parents, kids, and counselors and advisors to make sure that we were accessing that funding. And then you can see here some optional incentive funding in terms of CTE, providing for free testing for SAT, ACT in every classroom, and then even trying to help recapture our dropouts through providing a free GED test for those who did not complete their high school diploma. And then teaching was a big discussion. We brought in a lot of educators to talk about teacher pay. So we allocated about $1.6 billion increase to increasing teacher salaries across the board. But then we also gave districts the ability that if they wanted to evaluate their teachers on a multi-measurement system and take down funding that would allow them to pay their best teachers more and sooner to keep them in the classroom, and then pay upwards of $32,000 in additional salaries for your best top 5% teachers willing to teach in your highest poverty schools, the state would fund that. So we are now 2 years later, 35% of kids in Texas are now in a district that has applied for this funding and has agreed to move from solely seniority-based pay to pay that is based on multi-measure evaluation, principal observations, student surveys, student growth, et cetera. And I think it's going to be a game changer for us in our state in terms of attracting more teachers to come into the profession and to stay there in the classroom. And then finally, equity was a big deal in terms of just the fact that I pointed out that it was our low-income students that were behind the most. And so we put more money into what we call compensatory education funding based on economic disadvantage. And then we did a unique feature that we stole from San Antonio and we spread it statewide, which is that the higher the concentration of poverty in a school district, the more funding you get, because we saw big differences in achievement where you had districts that were 80, 90, 100% economically disadvantaged versus maybe 20%. And we know that concentrated poverty was producing lower outcomes and needed more resourcing. And then we just increased our basic allotment by roughly 20%. So the net result of all this was roughly a $3 billion increase per year in education funding, with the potential to access up to another $4 billion over time, depending on who wanted to pay their teachers more through an evaluation system, success funding in terms of outcomes, and then finally extending the school year to eliminate summer slide. So that was the net result of the bill. And again, as I mentioned earlier, highly, highly supported and championed by all the leadership and big margin and passage in the House and the Senate.
Awesome. Todd, thanks so much. That was just outstanding overview and really helpful information. And I think, lots that perhaps connects to some of the things that we've been thinking about in Tennessee. We know that obviously districts here have a significant investment of additional federal ESSER dollars and are thinking through how they're spending those dollars as part of their spending plans. The department in Tennessee has provided some templates for districts that encourage them to adopt research-based practices, which I think align with some of the things that you've shared, but also things like high dosage tutoring and summer learning camps. And we also have seen in Tennessee and continue to see some examples of innovations like differentiated compensation for educators working in schools serving high need students.
Right.
All of which I think connect to some of the things that you shared. I think the big opportunity here is thinking about the kinds of opportunities that we can build on with more comprehensive funding reform, which I think you've sort of shared why that's so important and how that can sort of focus on a specific set of student goals. I want to dig into one particular piece of what you shared, which I think is so interesting to learn more about, and that's this kind of work around outcomes-based funding and the sort of the driving sort of impetus and thinking around that as part of the Texas conversation. So I would be interested in hearing a little bit more about what were policymakers trying to solve for in implementing that as part of the funding reform or the funding package. How was it designed? And I think one of the things that you shared that was so interesting about that is it really connects to post-secondary sort of transition and post-secondary attainment. And so I'm curious about whether you feel like that's refocused or recentered conversations around post-secondary success.
I think it could be transformational, and I'll give you a perspective. So if you think about, there was from the testimony, there was a big difference in how certain charter schools funded the whole college access effort versus how traditional school districts funded it. And when you really dug into why, it was pretty clear that that high-performing charters that were focused on college prep were raising their philanthropy because they could prove that they got kids to and through. And so they were resourcing it. They were staffing their students at 50 students per advisor. We would have 500 students per advisor in a traditional ISD. And so the question is, how through public funding could we provide that same incentive to public ISDs that charters were doing by raising their philanthropy that allowed them to grow? We could have done a carrot or we could have done a stick. And we decided it's important to have a carrot because we need to resource that continuous improvement. And so when you talked about ESSER dollars, one of the really impactful conversations we're having with all of our districts, and I'll just use Dallas ISD as an example, if they can earn $45 million, but today they're only earning $3 million, they've got to make an investment to get that 3 up. And we said, listen, there's no other use of ESSER dollars today where you can actually invest it. And if you invest it well, you've created, based on our school finance reform, a permanently sustainable funding stream going forward. And so now many of our districts are taking part of their ESSER dollars to make the investment in the college access infrastructure because they know that they'll get more kids ready, they'll get more kids transitioned into college, and then they'll be able to be paid from the outcomes going forward. And I think it's particularly important given what's been happening in COVID. As a state of Texas, we've gone from 56% of our kids who graduate high school enrolling in college down to 45 in the last decade. Half of that decline was pre-COVID and half of that decline is post-COVID. So now we are actually graduating more kids who do not enroll in college than Florida is graduating kids total. And so we have got to figure out how to drive more of our resources to make sure that that K through 12 to higher ed handoff is highly, highly supported. And we've got the funding to do it, and ESSER can be the bridge.
And Todd, on the outcomes portion that you shared in HB3 and the sort of incentivizing of those post-secondary sort of transition measures, could you talk a little bit more about what that looked like? And also just to clarify, that's something that any school or school district is eligible for, right?
Doesn't matter how you're governed, doesn't matter if you're a traditional ISD charter, it's all available to all. And the reason I think it was politically embraced was the fact that obviously you can take the test multiple times, right? It's not just one day, one test like a standardized test would be for that you see in terms of, in the earlier grades. And that effectively, who can argue that the primary purpose of K-12 is not to make sure that you should be ready when you graduate and you were successfully transitioned to certification or to college? That's mission critical number one. Who could argue that you shouldn't be paid for that, right? And you should be resourced for it. And so I think it was, it really received very little focus in terms of pushback from school districts, and they saw it as a great win. And now as soon as that bill passed, we formed a network of consultants across the state to help districts think about how to build a college access infrastructure that would allow them to access that funding. And so we've got a number of our districts now that are doing and sitting and using the resources to help them think that through.
One last question on this topic, Todd, and I'm digging in here because this question of, or this focus on outcomes and performance has really been an important part of the broader conversation around funding reform in Tennessee too. So really want to make sure that we understand what this work has looked like in Texas. Could you also share, to the extent that you can, any examples of work that you think this approach has catalyzed or pushed forward that may not have happened before? Are there any schools or districts that you can think of that you're like, hey, they're not doing this and they may not have done it before?
I'm sitting in the middle of one of them. They're going to be, our school district here in Dallas ISD has indicated that they are likely going to quadruple their funding for college access in this area. They have actually also, the administration has presented a policy to the board that now requires them to come to the board annually, talking about their progress, not only what's happening with their kids post-graduation, but also how much of the funding they're taking down versus not taking down. So they can make the case about, let's invest more, because then we can be repaid by the state. But that could be a game changer for this district. When you think about quadrupling the amount, several $1 million more spending, because we just aren't advising kids, because we have not historically been able to resource it. Now we've got the funding to do it, and now Esther's going to provide the bridge. I just think it's and so now we bring together a lot of major school districts, both in our county but also statewide. We convene about 25% of the state's enrollment among these 20 districts. And we are basically, they've all set goals. We're benchmarking, we're providing capacity building. A lot of national funders are coming in to fund that capacity building because they see the benefit and the ROI of it. And so we're excited about it. But again, it's relatively early days.
One other question on the broader funding reform work, Todd, one of the things I think you shared is the sort of approach of bringing together lots of stakeholders around a common sort of set of goals that you were trying to reach. And I know I've heard you say before that being really clear on the goals that you're trying to reach is important as you're designing the way you might fund towards those goals. And would love if you could just talk a bit more about what that stakeholder engagement looks like, who is a part of that process. Obviously, you played a really important leadership role in that work, but would love to hear just a little bit more color commentary around who was engaged, what did that look like, and how did you think about stakeholders driving towards those goals around?
Sure. So I think that, again, our commission met for a full year, and we were meeting once to twice a month, all open to the public, all recorded. You can go and watch any testimony. We brought in national experts, we brought in local experts, we brought in teacher voice. But basically we were very focused on data. What is working somewhere in the state? Let's come in and listen to it. And is that worthy of replicating statewide? And I think here's the one thing I'll finally say. I thought the commission process ultimately got people together because for the first time we'd set a goal, and they really truly thought, I'm just not throwing money at a problem and hope it all kind of works out. They actually believed in the strategies because they'd listened to the testimony and they'd seen the data about what those strategies had meant in this district or that district. And they thought they were really solving a problem. And so some of our education committee members became our biggest champions for this bill, both with their colleagues, but also in touring the state statewide. And we did a very conscious job to bring the business community and the voice in this discussion, because this is their workforce pipeline, without a doubt. And so I think the unified voice of business was helpful, but it's just legislators just are more willing to put their shoulder behind something when they've seen the data and they've seen the analysis and they think they're really solving a goal versus just trying to keep all the education advocates happy.
All right, so that's a good transition to my next question. So you talked about data. Obviously, data is a core part of what you do at Commit. It was a core part of this important legislation. Could you share, when you think about the most important metrics as an example that you're tracking at Commit, what are those metrics? What are the most important data points when you're looking at sort of how students are progressing and through the kind of K-12 to post-secondary to career pathway? What are the most important data points you're looking at?
So obviously, early childhood is just it's huge for us. We did an analysis using state standardized test scores that said, if you meet the state standard in third grade reading, what is the likelihood that you'll continue to meet state standards going forward? 70 to 90%. We also said, if you don't meet the state standard in third grade, what's the likelihood that the district across the state will be able to recover you? Less than 20%. And yet third grade reading is only 1/17 of our 17 standardized exams, but it's really the culmination of 6 years of investment from pre-K 3 all the way through third grade. So third grade reading is a huge, but what are the contributing indicators that lead to that? And then I think obviously I'm a big believer that if you're not in a seat, doesn't matter the quality, you're not going to learn, right? And so if only half of our kids are enrolling in pre-K and only half of our kids are enrolling in college, we're losing huge numbers of kids that ultimately shows its effect in our third grade reading scores, and then ultimately in our post-secondary credential attainment and living wage job attainment. So huge drivers toward those big things about we have got to get kids into seats. And then we've obviously got to focus on the quality once they're in those seats, but we got to get them there.
One other maybe question and I should have asked this earlier. One other question, maybe on funding, the funding reform conversation. Obviously, Todd, you spent time as a public charter school leader in Texas as well, and would be curious to hear how you feel like this change, the way Texas thought about funding, what you funded, has impacted the public charter sector. What's that looked like? Has there been an impact? Any benefits that you would highlight?
No, I mean, again, I'm a big believer. I served on a charter school board, but I'm a big believer that the way we're going to get to outcomes is working through traditional school districts. Charters are great innovators. Some of them are. We have great charters, and we have some charters that frankly aren't very good at all. And so, but I keep the thing that I was just driven by was that, and why I pivoted the work into to doing the commit work was traditional ISDs are 94% of all kids in Texas, right? And so how do we support them? How do we make sure that we use funding streams to help them? So I haven't seen any material impact on charters relative to ISDs. They've all benefited by being able to access this funding for paying for their best teachers more, success funding and CCMR, et cetera.
Got it. All right. Want to also just mention for folks who are joining us, feel free to drop any questions you have in the chat box, and I'll lift them up here for Todd in our remaining 10 minutes or so in the conversation. One question, Todd, that we did get is about any improvements you've seen in third grade literacy through this work. I wonder if there's any examples or data points that you could share.
Well,
that would be.
Think about this. This bill is signed into law in June. Funding kicks in September 2019. COVID hits 6 months later. So no, the answer is no. I think our third grade reading scores have fallen maybe 7% from those numbers I showed you. And I think that they're probably going to be similar this year. So I will say this, I think we feel so much better that we funded what we funded, because now we've got all 80,000 teachers have now will shortly be trained in the science of reading. We've now seen significant increases in pre-K enrollment, no doubt about that. But then COVID hit, right? And so because we were funding pre-K. So it's early days. I think the biggest changes that I'm seeing, as I mentioned before, is so many of our districts are taking down this teacher incentive allotment to pay their best teachers more. And it's even more critical just given that what the pandemic has meant for teacher shortages in our state. People have just said, I'm done, I'm out, et cetera. And so I think being able, so to give you a sense, in Dallas ISD, our starting salaries are $56,000, $57,000 now, but our best teachers working in our most challenged schools are making between $100,000 and $130,000 a year. So
just in terms of the bill and Texas investments, Todd, is somebody asked a question about whether pre-K is required and kind of what that early learning experience
pre-K is not required, but if you do pre-K, it has to be done quality, which means it has to be done full day for 4-year-olds.
One other question, maybe last question I have on just a broader funding conversation, and we've talked about throughout this conversation, Todd, the sort of moment that we are in Tennessee with lots of sort of energy and focus around thinking about how to fund K-12 education differently and connect that to important goals that we have and make sure that we're investing in students in the right ways. You also talked about Commit's role as kind of being on the ground consultants in many ways and just supporting folks getting the work done. So I'm wondering if you could put your consultant hat on and consult for Team Tennessee here for a couple of minutes. Okay. What advice would you have for us? Watch outs, challenges, opportunities as we sort of engage in this conversation around rethinking the way we fund K-12 education. Anything that we should be particularly paying attention to? Anything that you think we ought to watch out for?
Sure.
Would be curious about your advice.
I would say keep students centered in all discussions. I would say be incredibly focused on robust data. I think Commit in Texas is viewed by people on both sides of the aisle as very student-centered, nonpartisan. Data speaks for the kids. What's working, what's not. Don't throw money at a problem just to throw money at a problem, but money spent well can be incredibly impactful. And then I think also getting your business community informed and engaged. It's even more so now. I mean, Dallas, many cities in Texas have been leading the nation in job growth. The labor shortages are getting incredibly acute right now. And so there's just heavy business focus. We just formed a commission to focus on community colleges, and I'm sitting on that one as well. We're in the early days, but we're going to have a set of recommendations, hopefully by the end of this year, to focus on community colleges, which educate about half of our kids in higher ed and are huge sources of dual credit, for example, which is critically important in this work.
Great. We can't wait to learn about that too. That's a major priority for, I know, a lot of stakeholders in Tennessee is thinking about how to support student success, persistence, completion, and then job attainment coming out of our state's community colleges as well. So we've got a lot to learn, I think, from the work you're doing there. All right, last question I have, Todd. Todd, this is a question we ask every guest on these sessions. And this is a question really about kind of putting your innovator and entrepreneur hat on and looking ahead to the future for us. If we were to think about maybe 20 years from now, the ways in which our public education system will look different, should look different, what would you want to see? What do you hope for 20 years from now as compared to where we are today?
I would say an integrated K through 12 through community college system, highly focused on believing, every school district believing I am the chief economic mobility institution for my community. It's not just about high school graduation. It's about making sure every student is ready and is transitioned and can be what they historically haven't seen. And it is highly aligned with labor market intelligence in terms of what jobs are needed, what they pay. And it's just a very intentional effort. Superintendents have told me we have never thought about ourselves until you pass the success funding as being that role, that chief economic mobility institution. And we need to think that way. And so I think we're on the path to doing that. We lose so many kids in our state because we underinvest in the transitions and we underinvest in the strategic supports. And we rely a lot on imported talent educated elsewhere. And we need to change that because we've got to narrow the spread between the haves and the have-nots in Texas.
Todd, thank you. I'm inspired by this conversation. Thanks for joining us. As Linda said at the beginning, we want to keep these sessions to under 45 minutes or so on a Friday morning. We want to respect everyone's busy day. But to really close here, just want to say thanks again, Todd, for being with us, for sharing the exciting work you're doing in Texas and in Dallas, and for sharing some things that we can learn from you, particularly as we move forward around a conversation about kind of reimagining school finance and K-12 education funding in our state. Very much appreciate the perspective and the advice as we think about the work ahead in Tennessee. Before we close, want to also just invite all of you to join us next month. We will reconvene again in March for our next Friday's Focus. We'll be announcing the date and our special guest for that next conversation very shortly. Look for the registration info soon, as well as a link to this morning's session, which we will share out via email, I believe later today, and it'll also be available on SCORE's YouTube page. Thank you all again for joining us this morning. Thanks, Todd, again for being with us. Hope you all have a great day, great weekend. Look forward to seeing you again soon.